Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a historical puzzle that has, well, just massive implications for the entire Western world.
Mm.
We're talking about the profound, rapid cultural and physical transformation of Great Britain.
Huge topic.
It is. Our mission for this deep dive is to take the sources you shared and really unpack the competing explanations. We're looking at a country that, achieved this incredible global victory in the 20th century.
The greatest, you could argue.
Exactly, and yet now it stands diminished. So the question is this just, inevitable geopolitical decline, or are we watching something darker, something like a deep internal self-destruction?
And I think we have to start by framing just how immense Britain's power really was at its peak.
Right.
The sources, they really emphasize that after World War I, the UK controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface.
A quarter.
A quarter. And this isn't some, historical exaggeration. This was a modern industrial empire. It was bigger than Rome, bigger than the Mongols.
And that context is what makes the decline so spectacular. I mean, within just 25 years of winning the two biggest wars in human history.
And sacrificing an entire generation to do it.
Yes. The country is described in the sources as becoming a sad, soggy, welfare state, diminished, often humiliated. How does the civilization win the war but lose its soul?
And this is the key thing for you to take away. This is not just an island phenomenon.
No.
The sources argue again and again that what happened to Britain is happening right now, simultaneously, across the entire Anglosphere.
Uh-huh.
The U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand.
And Western Europe, too.
And Western Europe. Yeah. So if we can get to the root of the British collapse, we might be looking at a blueprint for the decline of the whole modern West.
Okay, so let's unpack the easy answers first. The conventional explanations that, historians usually reach for. The geopolitical and economic shifts.
Right. The initial answers are they're powerful. You can't deny them. The wars were just cripplingly expensive.
The social cost, too.
Oh, immense. The sources cite that statistic you always hear, that half of the class of Eton in 1910
was killed in the trenches.
Gone. So that financial burden leads directly to the theory of power transfer.
Where the empire moved west.
Exactly. Britain basically had to liquidate its assets. And the power, the gold, the global responsibility, it all got transferred to the United States.
It sounds like a pretty managed, conventional decline on the surface.
It does. A great nation sees it can't afford the upkeep anymore and just sort of hands the reins to its successor.
But if it were just an economic transfer, the country would still be, well, recognizably Britain, right?
Yeah.
It'd be smaller, less dominant, but probably thriving internally. Why isn't that what the sources conclude?
Because the change they observe goes so much deeper than the economy. If Britain had just gotten poorer, its culture, its social fabric, its institutions, they'd still be largely intact.
But that's not what happened.
No. The shift is described as a cultural destruction. The argument is that Britain has become something fundamentally different, a country where the native population is showing behaviors consistent with, well, internal defeat, not just financial loss.
And this is where the core thesis of this whole deep dive really starts. The idea that this decline is fundamentally a spiritual phenomenon, not purely political or economic.
A spiritual phenomenon, yeah. In this context, that means a crisis of internal values and legitimacy. And to show this, the sources bring up a really shocking anecdote.
The case of the praying citizen.
Exactly. Detail that for us, because it really crystallizes the whole argument.
So we're talking about a woman in the UK. She's arrested outside an abortion clinic. Now, the crucial part is why she was arrested. It wasn't for obstruction. It wasn't for violence.
She didn't throw a firebomb.
Nothing like that. She was arrested for the internal act of merely praying, silently.
And the argument here is that the state is now prosecuting the invisible internal world of its citizens.
It has to be. Praying for someone can't be a crime. It's not a physical act. It doesn't harm anyone. So if the government is arresting you for a thought, for a spiritual impulse, you're watching a profound shift.
It's the state trying to control the conscience, which,
Yeah.
is a huge hallmark of an authoritarian environment, whatever its political flavor.
And this internal shift, this spiritual defeat, it has to manifest physically, right?
Yeah.
The sources link it directly to a visible loss of self-respect.
They do. You look at the internal crises like rising drug and alcohol use,
Mm-hmm.
but also just look at the public disorder. The sources make a big point that the streets are increasingly untidy, filled with litter, graffiti.
Most people would just see that as a minor city management problem. Why is that detail so critical to this argument?
Because people with dignity, with self-respect, they don't tolerate public filth. A clean environment reflects a sort of collective civic pride. So once a people lets that chaos and degradation into their immediate world, the analysts we looked at argue it's a mirror. It reflects how they feel about themselves. When you accept filth, you're signaling that you feel diminished.
And this whole pattern, the internal crises, the filth, the disorder, this is what the sources define as the behavior of a defeated people.
Even though they won the wars.
Right.
It's a powerful thesis. They're behaving as if they were conquered. The sources even compare it to the decline of indigenous American population.
That's so.
Well, after military defeat and then becoming dependent on an external system, those once, highly dignified cultures often suffered this profound self-destruction. Addiction, despair.
So the implication is that defeat doesn't have to be external. It can be programmed from within.
And lead to self-sabotage, exactly.
So these internal wounds, they have immediate consequences in the physical world, which brings us to the strain on infrastructure and the massive demographic transformation.
The demographic shift is it's breathtaking. 100 years ago, London was nearly 100% European white.
And today?
Today, it's less than 40%. That kind of transformation in a single lifetime is basically unprecedented.
And the sources point out this strange contrast in morale.
Yeah. Many of the newcomers, even with less money, they seem more balanced and happy.
Because they're not defeated.
They're not defeated. They feel ascendant. They don't hate themselves or their traditions. The population that's expressing the most anger and self-doubt is often the native one.
And that psychological pressure cooker feeds right into the failure of critical infrastructure.
Most obviously, the National Health Service, the NHS.
Yeah.
The population just grew so fast, from under 50 million to nearly 70 million. The NHS was once a gold standard, but it cannot cope with the sheer volume.
We have that really stark anecdote about Piers Morgan's mother. She suffers a heart attack.
Yeah.
But because of the volume of patients, she ends up on a trolley in a corridor with 30 other people.
The environment was described as third world.
Even though the specialist care she got later was excellent.
And that gap between world-class specialists and a triage system that looks like a war zone, that shows the system is structurally broken by volume. And this is all compounded by what the sources call just abject mismanagement of migration.
Let's pause on migration for a second. The sources point to management failures. Tony Blair opening the gates to Eastern Europe too fast, net migration recently hitting almost 1 million in a year.
Right.
But isn't there an acknowledgement that many of these critical services, especially the NHS, actually need high immigration to fill essential jobs? Doesn't that make it more of a complicated necessity, even if it was handled badly?
That is the ultimate complexity, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the analysts argue that the sheer speed and the total lack of integration planning for both illegal arrivals on boats and the huge legal volume, it created a self-inflicted crisis. It wasn't just who came, but how quickly the governing class just lost control of the pace and scale.
Which fuels that sense of disenfranchisement among the native population.
Exactly.
And when politicians focus national identity just on protecting a failing system like the NHS, the sources suggest that's aiming a little low.
It is. It distracts from traditional British values that used to define the nation. Things like self-restraint, duty, courage, fairness.
Which brings us to the ultimate consequence of this internal defeat, the loss of sovereignty and the suppression of self-control.
This cultural self-hatred is palpable. The sources note that the West is almost unique in that its native populations find it embarrassing to fly their national flag.
If you're actively shaming the symbols of your own nation,
It's seen as a kind of generalized self-hatred.
and that then manifests in the physical choice to not continue the culture. We see it in birth rates.
Yeah, the sources cite the UK's 40% abortion rate for conceived children, which is primarily among the native population.
And you couple that with widespread birth control and this cultural idea that your career is more important than reproduction.
It's seen as a deliberate, voluntary stop to continuation. And if that doesn't symbolize a people choosing to exit the stage, the ultimate extension is the push for state-sponsored suicide, which is already happening in Canada.
It's the final act of a population that has broken itself inside.
But the internal defeat is maybe most visible in the loss of basic liberty, specifically free speech, which just runs counter to centuries of British legal tradition.
Rooted in common law, Magna Carta, all designed to protect the individual from the state.
Precisely. And now Britain, once the global defender of free expression, is described as an authoritarian country where disagreement gets thousands of people jailed every year.
The comparison the source materials make is astonishing. They claim 3 times as many arrests for speech crimes in the UK last year as in Putin's Russia.
Despite the UK having half the population.
Wait, hold on. Isn't that data point heavily reliant on how each country defines a speech crime? I mean, that claim sounds almost unbelievable. How do the sources justify that?
That's a necessary critical question for sure. And while the definitions do vary, the sources use specific documented cases to illustrate the intensity of the enforcement. It's about showing the state's priorities and its willingness to use disproportionate force to shut down dissent, whatever the formal definition is.
And the examples are staggering. The comedian Graham Linehan, arrested by 5 armed police at Heathrow Airport.
Over a joke on X?
A social media platform. But the case that really shows you where the system's priorities are is Elizabeth Penny, a mother of 4.
She was physically beaten up by her abusive boyfriend.
Right, so she texts a friend, and in the text, she describes him using a specific slur.
And she was the one arrested, convicted of a hate crime for the text. Meanwhile, the abusive boyfriend who actually beat her was not arrested for the physical violence.
That story tells you everything you need to know. The system is set up to prosecute words that challenge an orthodoxy.
You criticize migration or gender ideology at your peril.
Right, while sidelining actual physical violence. And it protects the abuser over the victim.
And this feeds right back into that cultural decline we talked about. The loss of basic manners, politeness. Young men not opening doors for women, for example. It's happening because people have been conditioned to fear being accused of toxic masculinity.
So the native population is actively participating in diminishing its own social norms.
The great irony, as you mentioned before, is that the ascendant newcomers often have a greater sense of duty, self-respect, basic politeness than the native population that's enforcing the rules of its own diminishment.
It's the ultimate self-negation.
It is. The sources are really clear that the decline is driven not just by external forces, but by the native peoples, participating in it enthusiastically and then enforcing its rules against anyone who questions it. They are arresting their own neighbors, enforcing the silence.
So what does this all mean? We've gone through economic strain, demographic pressure, infrastructure failure, but the whole narrative really hinges on this idea of an internal spiritual collapse, the willingness of a culture to self-destruct.
The conclusion is that the British decline is unique because it's voluntary. The internal mechanisms of self-hatred and fear have become more powerful than any external challenge.
We noted that Britain's systems were globally respected for one core concept: fairness, rooted in things like the Magna Carta. So given this documented rise in free speech suppression, this focus on prosecuting words over violence, what specific cultural quality must the native population revive internally if they're going to resist this defeat? What does it take to safeguard the core values of their civilization?
That is the critical question for you to mull over. Is it renewed stoicism, a defense of individual conscience? How do you foster that individual dignity when your whole society is actively conditioning you into passivity and shame, demanding that you enforce the rules of your own negation? To reverse the trend, the answer has to be internal first.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.